Rumors in the NFL don't need confirmation to feel real. They just need repetition. And right now, one name keeps getting dragged into conversations that feel louder than the facts behind them. Shedeur Sanders has gone from developing quarterback to alleged expendable piece almost overnight, and that shift didn't come from the team itself. Over the past few days, media chatter has escalated fast. Reports, opinions, and speculation have blended together, creating the impression that Cleveland may already be ready to move on. No official statement, no direct confirmation, just a growing sense that a decision has been made somewhere behind closed doors. And when that kind of narrative takes hold, it becomes incredibly difficult to reverse. What makes this situation even more unsettling is where the loudest voices are coming from. Not team executives, not coaches, but media personalities and insiders framing opinions as inevitabilities. Some have gone as far as suggesting Shedeur has already hit his ceiling, a label that, once attached, has a way of following players long before their careers actually unfold. To be clear, none of this has been confirmed. These are rumors, interpretations, and debates fueled by off-season silence. But silence is exactly what allows speculation to thrive. And in a market like Cleveland, where quarterback uncertainty has lingered for years, even a hint of doubt becomes a headline. The real question is whether Shedeur is perfect. It's whether he's being judged fairly, or whether narratives are forming faster than opportunities. Because once a player is discussed as temporary, the damage often happens before any decision is ever announced. And once you trace where this story actually started, the picture becomes far more complicated. What's important to understand is that this story didn't begin with an announcement from the team. It didn't start with a leaked memo or a confirmed decision. It started the way most modern NFL narratives do, with speculation repeated often enough that it began to sound like fact. Mentions turned into segments. Segments turned into headlines. And suddenly, Shedeur Sanders was being discussed as if his future had already been decided. The most striking part is how quickly the language changed. Early off-season talk focused on development, competition, and patience. But within days, that tone shifted. Words like could move on, might not fit, and already capped began popping up across media platforms. None of those phrases came from the organization itself. They came from interpretations, opinions framed with confidence, then echoed elsewhere without context. This is how perception snowballs. When one voice suggests something, it's easy to dismiss. When 5 repeat it, it feels credible understanding. When 10 say it, fans start assuming something must be happening behind the scenes. And before long, a rumor becomes a storyline that everyone feels obligated to react to, including the player at the center of it. Another factor that accelerated this was timing. The Browns are once again in a familiar position, uncertainty at quarterback and pressure to get it right. That pressure creates an environment where every off-season whisper carries extra weight. Fans are restless. Media outlets want clarity. And in the absence of firm answers, speculation fills the gap. What often gets lost in moments like this is proportion. No team decision has been announced. No depth chart has been finalized. No future path has been confirmed. Yet the discussion around Cleveland Browns has already begun shifting from what could happen to what's assumed to happen. That leap is subtle, but it's powerful. This doesn't mean concerns are illegitimate. Every quarterback faces scrutiny. But when scrutiny turns into certainty without evidence, it stops being evaluation and starts becoming narrative control. And once that happens, players don't just compete on the field. They compete against stories written before they ever get another snap. That's why it matters where this all began. Because the louder the rumor gets, the harder it becomes to separate reality from repetition. And the next wave of commentary only pushed that divide even further. The moment this conversation truly caught fire was when media voices stopped talking about development and started talking about limits. That's when the word ceiling entered the chat. And once that label sticks to a quarterback, it's almost impossible to shake. One of the loudest moments came from Aaron Goldhammer, who suggested that what fans are seeing from Shedeur Sanders might already be the finished product. Not close to the ceiling, not approaching it, but there, fully reached. For many fans, that wasn't just criticism, it felt like a verdict. What made the comment even more polarizing was the comparison game that followed. Shedeur was suddenly being measured against quarterbacks deep into their NFL journeys. Players with years of reps, system stability, and organizational backing. That comparison didn't sit right with a lot of people, especially when the same voices making those arguments had previously missed badly on other quarterbacks using similar logic. And that's where the pushback began. Critics weren't saying Shedeur is flawless. They weren't denying areas that need improvement. What they questioned was how quickly the conversation jumped from still growing to already capped. Because in the NFL, ceilings are usually identified after sustained opportunity, not before it. There's also the subtle language that often slips in during these debates. Phrases like "nice kid" or "good young man" tend to raise eyebrows when attached to criticism. Not because they're inherently negative, but because they're rarely used when analysts talk about franchise cornerstones. Fans notice patterns, and once they do, those patterns become part of the narrative. To be fair, none of these comments confirm a team decision. Media opinions don't equal front office plans, but they do shape perception. And perception influences everything: fan expectations, pressure on the organization, and even how future performances are interpreted. What's dangerous about the ceiling label is that it reframes mistakes. Instead of being viewed as growing pains, they become confirmation. Every bad rep reinforces the idea. Every good rep gets minimized as an exception. That's how narratives trap players long before their careers have a chance to breathe. And once that framing takes hold publicly, it doesn't just stay in the media. It seeps into the broader conversation around the team, which is exactly why the reaction to these comments was so intense, because fans have seen this movie before. And the next chapter only deepened the divide between evaluation and bias. This is where the conversation stops being subtle, because once you line things up side by side, the standard Shedeur Sanders is being held to starts looking very different from the one applied to others. Not harsher criticism, different expectations altogether. One of the biggest examples people keep pointing to is how quickly patience disappears in Shedeur's case. Mistakes are framed as proof. Flaws are framed as ceilings. Meanwhile, other quarterbacks with similar or even worse inconsistencies are treated as long-term projects who just need time. That contrast hasn't gone unnoticed, especially when those same analysts have been wrong before. Take the way the league talked about Caleb Williams early on. Plenty of voices questioned his readiness, leadership, and style. Some even dismissed him outright. Fast forward, and once success arrived, those doubts magically turned into growing pains. Same traits, new interpretation. That's the part fans keep circling back to. With Shedeur, the order feels reversed. The doubts arrive before the opportunity. His confidence is labeled arrogance. His competitiveness is called recklessness. His composure under pressure is rebranded as stubbornness. These aren't football-only critiques, they're perception-based, and perception is rarely applied evenly. What fuels frustration is that the Browns' context never seems to matter in these evaluations. Quarterback play doesn't exist in isolation. Protection, scheme stability, coaching continuity, all of it shapes outcomes. Yet when Cleveland Browns struggle structurally, the quarterback absorbs the blame disproportionately. That's a familiar pattern for this franchise. Even the way comparisons are made feels off. Shedeur is measured against playoff-caliber veterans, while others are measured against their draft slot or supposed upside. It's an impossible bar, and once that bar is set unfairly high, every performance feels like a disappointment, no matter the context. To be clear, this isn't about claiming bias as fact. It's about acknowledging perception. Fans aren't asking for praise. They're asking for consistency. If development is allowed for one quarterback, it should be allowed for another. If patience is part of the process, it shouldn't vanish based on narrative momentum. Because when evaluation standards change depending on the name on the jersey, the outcome is usually predetermined. And that's why this part of the debate has struck such a nerve. It's not just about Shedeur anymore. It's about who gets time to grow and who's expected to arrive finished. And once fans start asking that question, the spotlight shifts away from the player and straight onto the system judging him. At some point, the conversation drifted away from reads, footwork, and timing, and that's when things started feeling off. The critiques aimed at Shedeur Sanders weren't just about what happened between the lines anymore. They were about optics, body language, sideline posture, even how he carried himself when cameras weren't focused on the play itself. That shift matters because once evaluation moves into those areas, it becomes subjective fast. Analysts began highlighting moments that had little to do with performance: arms folded on the sideline, reactions after a missed kick, demeanor during tough stretches. None of these things show up in a box score, and yet they were being used to question leadership, maturity, and readiness. Supporters pushed back immediately. They pointed out moments that told a very different story: consoling teammates, taking accountability, staying engaged even when things weren't going well. Those clips existed too. They just didn't fit the narrative gaining momentum. And in the NFL media cycle, narratives tend to decide which moments get amplified. This is where perception becomes dangerous. Once a player is framed a certain way, everything gets filtered through that lens. Confidence becomes arrogance. Passion becomes a problem. Silence becomes sulking. It's no longer about what's happening, it's about how it's interpreted. And interpretation rarely comes with consistency. What frustrates fans most is how selectively this standard is applied. Plenty of quarterbacks show emotion on the sideline. Plenty carry themselves with edge. When veterans do it, it's leadership. When young players do it, it's questioned. That double standard isn't written anywhere, but it's enforced all the same. For the Cleveland Browns, this creates a strange dynamic. Media narratives start shaping public expectation before the organization ever speaks. Fans debate character instead of scheme, and the actual football conversation gets buried under personality analysis. To be clear, leadership matters, maturity matters, but those traits are usually judged over time, not through freeze frames and selective moments. When they're used prematurely, they become tools to justify conclusions already forming. And once criticism leaves the field, it rarely comes back quietly. It lingers. It follows the player. It changes how every future mistake is received. Which is why this stage of the discussion marked a turning point. Because now, the debate wasn't just about whether Shedeur could improve. It was about whether he was being evaluated as a quarterback or as a narrative. This is where the noise reached its loudest point. Suddenly, everything was being judged through a microscopic window of time. One weekend, one stretch, one comparison taken completely out of context. And once that happened, rational evaluation gave way to something far more dangerous: a prisoner of the moment scouting. In the NFL ecosystem, nothing fuels overreaction faster than short-term success elsewhere. A few strong performances from other quarterbacks, especially on big stages, can instantly reset expectations. Analysts begin asking why one player doesn't look like another, ignoring the years of development, system stability, and organizational patience that led to those outcomes in the first place. That's exactly what started happening around Shedeur Sanders. Names were thrown into the conversation rapidly: prospects from winning programs, quarterbacks backed by veteran rosters and experienced coaching staffs. Suddenly, Shedeur wasn't being evaluated on his own trajectory. He was being stacked against idealized versions of players in completely different situations. That kind of comparison isn't just unfair, it's misleading. What often gets overlooked in these moments is context, age, experience, team structure, coaching continuity. Some quarterbacks thrive early because they step into environments built to protect and amplify them. Others are asked to survive chaos while learning on the fly. The difference shows up on tape, but the reasons behind it rarely make headlines. This is where draft hype plays a role. When a quarterback is labeled hot or rising, flaws get explained away as fixable. When another is labeled questionable, those same flaws are treated as permanent. The evaluation flips not because the player changed, but because the narrative did. And narratives are notoriously difficult to reverse once they gain traction. For the Cleveland Browns, this environment creates pressure from all sides. Fans want answers. Media wants a storyline. Scouts want certainty. And in that rush, patience becomes a liability instead of a strategy. That's how teams end up making decisions they later regret, not because the talent wasn't there, but because the moment demanded action. This doesn't mean Shedeur should be immune to criticism. It means criticism should be proportional. Evaluations should be grounded in trajectory, not snapshots. Because when teams chase the moment instead of the process, they often mistake readiness for promise and promise for permanence. And that's the trap. Once prisoner of the moment thinking takes over, development stops being the goal. Validation becomes it. And for quarterbacks, that's rarely how lasting success is built. Which brings us to the most uncomfortable part of this entire conversation: time. Or more accurately, how little of it some players are actually given. This is the question that keeps resurfacing, no matter how the debate shifts. Not whether Shedeur Sanders is perfect, not whether he has things to clean up, but whether he was ever actually given real time to develop, the kind quarterbacks around the league quietly depend on to survive. In theory, development sounds simple. In practice, it's rare. Real time isn't just weeks on a calendar. It's meaningful reps. It's knowing mistakes won't immediately cost you your place. It's understanding that growth is expected, not feared. And that's where skepticism starts creeping in for a lot of fans and analysts watching this situation unfold. When people talk about Shedeur's up and down stretch, they often gloss over the environment surrounding it. Limited continuity, shifting expectations, a team still trying to figure out its own identity. Quarterbacks usually stabilize after the structure around them stabilizes, not before. But here, the evaluation seemed to move faster than the foundation. What adds to the frustration is the comparison to patience shown elsewhere in the organization. Coaches are often granted multiple seasons to implement systems, adjust philosophies, and learn from failures. Quarterbacks, especially young ones, rarely get that luxury. The margin for error is thinner. The clock moves faster. And once doubt enters the conversation, it accelerates everything. Reports and commentary suggest that Shedeur's window may have been narrower than most fans realized. Not officially closed, but never fully open either. That gray area is brutal for quarterbacks. You're expected to play freely while knowing every rep might be your last impression. That pressure doesn't create growth. It creates hesitation. To be clear, there's no confirmation that the Cleveland Browns intentionally rushed any judgment. Front offices rarely admit timelines publicly, but outcomes often reveal more than statements. When evaluation happens without extended opportunity, it raises fair questions about whether the process matched the expectations being placed on the player. Fans have also pointed out the irony. Had circumstances broken slightly differently, an injury here, a decision there, Shedeur might not have seen the field at all. That alone suggests how fragile his opportunity really was. And fragile opportunities rarely lead to clear conclusions. This is why the conversation has shifted from performance to process. Because before deciding what a quarterback is, you have to be honest about what he was allowed to become. And if the time was never truly there, then neither was the evaluation. And once that realization sets in, the conversation stops being about one player and starts being about how easily potential can slip away without anyone ever officially closing the door. By the time all the noise settles, one thing becomes clear. This story was never just about Shedeur Sanders. He's simply the name attached to a much larger pattern, one the NFL keeps repeating, often without realizing the damage it causes. Quarterbacks don't fail in isolation. They fail inside systems, timelines, and narratives that decide their fate long before the public ever sees the full picture. Talent matters, but belief matters more. Opportunity matters more. And once doubt becomes louder than patience, the result is almost always the same stalled development followed by a rushed conclusion. For the Cleveland Browns, this moment represents another crossroads, not just in terms of roster decisions, but in philosophy. Do they continue cycling through quarterbacks based on short-term impressions and media pressure? Or do they finally commit to a process that allows growth to look messy before it looks successful? What makes this situation uncomfortable is how familiar it feels. The language, the urgency, the comparisons, the sudden certainty from people who were unsure just weeks earlier. Fans have seen how this ends. A quarterback leaves, another arrives, expectations reset, and the same questions resurface a year later. None of this guarantees Shedeur would become a long-term answer. That's not the claim. The real issue is whether he was ever evaluated in a way that made success possible. Because when opportunity is conditional, development becomes optional, and optional development rarely works in the NFL. This is also a reminder of how powerful narratives are. Once a player is framed as temporary, every mistake feels final. Every success feels discounted. And by the time a fair judgment could be made, the door is already halfway closed. That's not evaluation. That's momentum disguised as analysis. Maybe Cleveland pivots. Maybe they recommit. Maybe Shedeur ends up thriving elsewhere. All of those outcomes are still possible. But whichever path unfolds, it will say more about the environment than the individual, about patience versus panic, about process versus perception. So when people ask whether this is the end of Shedeur Sanders in Cleveland, they may be asking the wrong question. The better one is this: how many quarterbacks before him faced the same quiet countdown, and how many will face it again? Because until that cycle breaks, this story won't end here. It'll just change names.